Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This continent no longer confronts the specter of communism. But today we're in the West, and we have to say there are dire threats to our security and to our way of life. You see what's happening out there. They are threats. We will confront them. We will win.
In a major speech in Poland, President Trump says Western civilization is at stake. He was often cheered by supporters of Poland's right-wing government who were bussed into the speech. We'll get response and go to Hamburg, Germany, where protests ahead of the G20 have already begun. Then we look at the crisis in Syria, ahead of Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We note in particular that the intensification of airstrikes, which have paved the ground for an SDF advance in Raqqa, has resulted not only staggering loss of civilian life, but has also led to 160,000 civilians fleeing their homes and becoming internally displaced.
We'll speak to Abdulaziz Al-Hamza, one of the founders of Raqqa, is being slaughtered silently. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration Wednesday threatened military action against North Korea over its nuclear weapons program, saying the U.S. is prepared to defend itself and its allies. The threat came a day after North Korea successfully tested a new intercontinental ballistic missile, which the U.S. says is capable of reaching Alaska. This is U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, speaking in an emergency meeting she called of the UN Security Council.
Their actions are quickly closing off the possibility of a diplomatic solution. The United States is prepared to use the full range of our capabilities to defend ourselves and our allies. One of our capabilities lies with our considerable military forces. We will use them if we must, but we prefer not to have to go in that direction.
Haley said the U.S. would soon propose new sanctions against North Korea, adding the U.S. is prepared to, quote, go our own path if UN members don't agree to its terms. Meanwhile, Russia and China urged restraint. Russian Ambassador Vladimir Savrenkov called on the U.S. and South Korea to stop large-scale joint military exercises while urging North Korea to halt tests of missiles and warheads. He also called on the U.S. to dismantle the THAAD anti-ballistic missile system.
The deployment of the THAAD system in Northeast Asia is a serious blow to the strategic stability of the region, including for Russia and China, and certainly does not serve to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula based on the principle of ensuring peace and stability in the region.
The new South Korean president is also opposed to the THAAD missile system, and last month ordered an investigation after learning that 4 more missile launchers had been brought into South Korea without his knowledge. In Poland, President Trump said in a major speech today the future of Western civilization is at stake as he warned against the threats of terrorism and extremism. Trump spoke in Krasinski Square, near the site of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising against the Nazis. Earlier, President Trump spoke briefly at a joint news conference with the Polish President Andrzej Duda. Trump repeated his recent attacks on CNN, calling the network fake news. Trump also said Russia probably meddled in the 2016 U.S. election, along with others.
Mistakes have been made. I agree. I think it was Russia, but I think it was probably other people and/or countries, and I see nothing wrong with that statement. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows for sure.
President Trump will next travel to Hamburg, Germany, where he'll join other leaders of the world's top economies at the G20 summit, including his first meeting as president with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. Ahead of the talks, thousands of people converged on the city for protests. This is protest spokesperson Georg Ismail.
We want to discuss the fact that 20 dangerous criminals from around the world are meeting here who are responsible for the highest military expenses, who are involved in all the wars of the world, who are significantly responsible for a climate catastrophe, and who are responsible for freezing or greatly shrinking our salaries.
On Wednesday, 1,000 demonstrators covered themselves head to toe in gray and shuffled through the streets of Hamburg in a procession of zombies symbolizing political apathy. In Iraq, the United Nations warned Wednesday up to 20,000 civilians remain trapped in Mosul as ISIS fighters battle to control their last stronghold in the city. UN humanitarian coordinator for Iraq, Lisa Gran, said civilians remain in extreme danger, adding the destruction in western Mosul is unprecedented.
Western Mosul, what we're seeing is the worst damage of the entire conflict. So in those neighborhoods where the fighting has been the fiercest, we're looking at levels of damage incomparable to anything else that has happened in Iraq so far.
The United Nations warned the price of restoring basic infrastructure to Mosul will top $1 billion. Meanwhile, in Syria, thousands of residents continue to flee Raqqa as U.S.-backed militias intensified their assault on the ISIS-held city. On Wednesday, escaping civilians arrived at an open-air relief camp outside Raqqa, complaining of constant airstrikes, artillery raids, and extreme hunger.
We left because of the fighting. We were afraid. We have children. We almost died of hunger, and no one helped us.
We are displaced now, and we live in the open air. These are our house belongings. We just managed to get them today. This is what we have. These are the last things we owned in the house.
Some 200,000 people have been displaced from Raqqa, with more expected to flee as fighting intensifies. U.S.-led airstrikes have killed hundreds of residents in what UN investigators have called a staggering loss of civilian life. We'll have more on Raqqa later in the broadcast. In Venezuela, dozens of supporters of President Nicolas Maduro stormed the National Assembly Wednesday, attacking opposition lawmakers with rock sticks and firecrackers. Video from the chaotic scene showed 2 members of the assembly with blood running down their faces. At least 7 lawmakers were reportedly injured. Speaking at a military parade celebrating the anniversary of Venezuela's independence, President Maduro condemned the violence.
At the door and in some of the gardens and hallways of the National Assembly, there were incidents of unrest and violence. I absolutely condemn these acts.
At least 90 people have died during weeks of political turmoil in Venezuela as opposition protesters hoping to topple President Maduro have set up checkpoints, staged massive protests, and assassinated a judge who jailed an opposition leader. Meanwhile, a Venezuelan police officer who led a helicopter attack last week on the country's Interior Ministry and Supreme Court released a new video Wednesday vowing a second wave of attacks. Oscar Perez apparently recorded the video from behind after abandoning his helicopter during his escape.
There are 30 million Venezuelans that go with truth, and they will have to imprison the entire country in order to silence our mission, our duty, our patriotism, our fight. We will go to the street, and we will be there with you. You are not alone.
Opposition leaders have accused President Maduro of working with Perez to stage last week's attack, which damaged government buildings but did not injure anybody. Maduro called the attack terrorism and an attempted coup d'etat. In Virginia, prison officials are preparing to execute a condemned man using a 3-drug lethal injection cocktail that critics say will lead to a torturous death equivalent to drowning. 32-year-old William Morva is scheduled to receive the lethal drugs at 9 p.m. this evening at the Greensville Correctional Facility. According to autopsy records, the last prisoner killed by Virginia 6 months ago, Ricky Gray, died after the same lethal injection method brought on acute pulmonary edema, effectively drowning Gray in blood-tinged fluid he coughed up during the execution. Morva's attorneys argue the approach is unconstitutionally cruel and unusual. In Chicago, a wave of violence over the long holiday weekend claimed 102 victims, with 15 people killed and 86 others injured by gunfire. Police say amateur fireworks confused and overwhelmed the computerized shot spotter system, which uses microphones to track gunshots and alert police. The youngest person injured was a 13-year-old boy seriously wounded by gunfire on Friday. In New York, employees at the Bronx Lebanon Hospital remain in mourning after a doctor killed one of his former colleagues and injured 6 others in a shooting rampage at the hospital on Friday. Dr. Henry Bello used an AR-15 assault rifle he purchased legally from an upstate New York gun store, even though he had a criminal record for unlawful imprisonment and left his hospital job in April over unspecified personal problems. Meanwhile, U.S. Congress member Steve Scalise is back in intensive care as he recovers from multiple surgeries following an attack last month that also wounded 4 other people. Doctors say Congressman Scalise is at risk of infection after a round from an AR-15 shattered his hip and tore through his blood vessels. He was attacked on a baseball field. And in Turkey, Amnesty International is demanding the release of the director of its Turkish operations and 7 other human rights activists after they were detained by police Wednesday at a workshop. In a statement, Amnesty International Secretary General Salil Shetty called for the release of Idil Eser and those detained with her, adding, quote, Eser's incommunicado detention and that of the other human rights defenders attending a routine training event is a grotesque abuse of power and highlights the precarious situation facing human rights activists in the country. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In a major speech in Poland earlier today, President Trump said the future of Western civilization is at stake as he warned against the threats of terrorism and extremism. Trump spoke in Krasinski Square near the site of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising against the Nazis.
This continent no longer confronts the specter of communism. But today we're in the West, and we have to say there are dire threats to our security and to our way of life. You see what's happening out there. They are threats. We will confront them. We will win. But they are threats. We are confronted by another oppressive ideology, one that seeks to export terrorism and extremism all around the globe. America and Europe have suffered one terror attack after another. We're going to get it to stop.
President Trump's speech was often interrupted by applause. According to news reports, supporters of the right-wing Polish government were bussed in to hear Trump's speech. Trump arrived in Poland Wednesday and met with Poland's President Andrzej Duda before his Warsaw speech. Poland has one of the furthest right governments in Europe and is currently defying European Union rules by refusing to allow refugees into Poland.
Meanwhile, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports Trump is facing criticism after becoming the first U.S. president in decades to skip visiting the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument. We're joined now by the Polish-Nigerian journalist Remi Adekoya. He's a regular contributor to The Guardian and the former political editor of the Warsaw Business Journal. His latest article for The Guardian is Poland's courting of Trump is a few supporters short of a picnic. We welcome you, Remi, to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the significance of President Trump's trip to Poland before he goes to the G20? Remi, were you able to hear that question, talking about the significance of President Trump's trip?
Well, President Trump obviously wanted to start off in a place where he'd be greeted warmly. So as you mentioned, the right-wing government of Poland right now, which is very pro-Trump and very much in support of Trump's worldview, are busting their supporters. Trump gave this speech, as you said, was full of historical analogies and symbolism. He talked about how Poland had endured the invasion of Nazi Germany, how after that Poland had to endure Soviet communism. And then he now drew an analogy to what is going on now and defined the main threat, as he said, for Western civilization in terrorism. And he said the fundamental question which the West now faces is whether it has the will to survive. Now, of course, the rhetorical implication of that question is perhaps the West does not have the will to survive. And this is important because countries like Poland, the Polish right-wing government, and a lot of the current right-wing governments in Eastern Europe have been suggesting in the past 1-2 years that essentially Western Europe seems to have lost its self-preservative instincts. That basically it's too obsessed with political correctness, it's too obsessed with multiculturalism, and it essentially is not doing enough to fight the threats of Islamic terrorism, or even to realize that actually having a lot of Muslims in Europe can be a huge problem. Poland is one of the main countries which refused to take in any migrants during the 2015-2016 migrant crisis in Europe, when suddenly 1 million refugees found themselves in Europe. So the fact Trump made this speech in Poland is significant. He would not most probably have been able to make this kind of speech in Western Europe to the kind of reception which he did get in Poland, which was very positive. But like I said, supporters of this right-wing government who were basically shouting Donald Trump throughout the speech.
And Remy, can you talk specifically about what the similarities are in the positions that the Trump administration has taken and those of right-wing governments in Eastern Europe, including Poland?
Number one, essentially the Polish government has said they're not interested in accepting any migrants. So generally there's a sort of anti-migrant, xenophobic stance in their policies. Number two, they question the existence of climate change, just like Trump does. And number three, in the case of the Polish government, they're very skeptical of what they see as German domination of the EU, which is a theme which Trump also touched in one of the interviews, saying the EU is essentially a union which is dominated by Germany. So on these three issues, the Polish government is very close to what Donald Trump is saying. Essentially, it's a very right-wing view of the world, exclusivist, which believes that, as they say, Western civilization is under threat, read from brown people, from Muslims especially, and has to close ranks and defend itself, or else it essentially faces extinction.
And what about the significance of Trump deciding to speak in Poland and meet the Polish head of state before going to Germany or meeting Angela Merkel?
Well, essentially, Polish diplomacy, one must acknowledge, sort of played it smart, let's say here. Essentially, they knew Trump was scheduled to go to the G20 summit. So Polish diplomacy, the Polish foreign ministry, were the ones who reached out to Washington, asking for Trump to visit Poland on his way to the G20 summit and assuring him essentially that he'd meet with a very positive reception in Poland and it would be a very good start for his European trip. There'd be good, optics, there'd be crowds, there'd be people waving, there'd be people cheering. They assured him that generally the Polish people are very supportive of his policies, in contrast to perhaps some of the nations in Western Europe. And generally it would be a good way for him to launch his European trip on a, sort of give him momentum launching into his European trip. Of course, this is not strictly true regarding the fact that Poles are very supportive of Donald Trump's policies, because Pew Research, a survey which was released last week, showed that only 23% of Poles have confidence in Donald Trump to, quote unquote, do what is right in global affairs. Now, we compare this to when Obama was leaving office. At that time, 58% of Poles had confidence in Barack Obama to do the right thing in global affairs. Now, only 23% of Poles have confidence in Donald Trump to do the right thing in world affairs. So it is not the case that Poles as a whole are very supportive of Donald Trump or his style of politics. But the Polish government was able to sell this to him, promise him this rousing welcome, and get him to make this speech here.
Remy Adekoya, can you talk about your own story as a Polish Nigerian?
Yeah. What specifically were you thinking about?
Your background.
Well, my background, my dad was Nigerian and my mom was Polish. I was born in Nigeria, lived there for the first 17 years of my life. Then I moved to Poland in 1995 as a student and living there for since then, essentially. Now I shuttle between the UK and Poland. And yes, that's it. I've seen the changes in Poland. When I arrived in Poland, the country was just 6 years out of communism. There were very few foreigners in the country, as you can imagine, definitely very few black people. things weren't always very pleasant. With time, things improved regarding the treatment of foreigners and treatment of black people. I mean, there was a time in the mid to late 90s when you could hardly walk on the street without hearing a racial insult hurled at you. But towards the early 2000s, so some 10 years after the end of communism, and when Poland joined the EU finally in 2004, the economy improved and people's moods generally improved. Poles got a little bit more used to seeing foreigners on the streets. Those kind of, let's say, racial insults just hurled on the streets just like that stopped, and things improved vastly. Unfortunately, since this government came back in, the current Polish government in 2015, they used the migrant crisis of 2015 when there were 1 million refugees essentially within Europe's borders looking for where to go. They used that crisis to scare Poles into essentially making the argument that, look at what is happening in France, look at what is happening in countries like the UK. They've got terrorism there because of all these Muslims who are there. Do we want that? Obviously, we don't. So we can't allow them, the EU, that is, to push on us, these migrant refugees, these Muslims, and tell us that we have to take care of them, because essentially, not all Muslims might be terrorists, but some of them definitely are, so why take the risk? And since then, for the past 2 years, there's been a concerted propaganda effort to scare Poles into believing that essentially accepting a few thousand Muslims is essentially inviting terrorist attacks. An example of showing you how, is this propaganda which has changed the mood a lot. In 2015, at the beginning of the migrant crisis, when Poles were asked whether Poland should accept some of the migrants, it was roughly 50-50%. A slight majority said Poland should accept migrants, 51-52%. A couple of months ago, 2 months ago, after 2 years of this government's propaganda, right now 75% of Poles are against accepting any migrants. So you see here the work, you see the effect of the propaganda in just within 2 years.
Let me ask you about the speech that President Trump just gave in Warsaw. That's being billed as a major address. He actually spent a good amount of time talking about the Warsaw Uprising. He wasn't talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In fact, as far as I could see and listen, I don't think he referred to the Jewish ghetto at all. Now, in the New York Times, they said Michael Shudrik, Poland's chief rabbi, and other Jewish leaders issued a statement Thursday morning that was critical of the White House's decision not to visit a monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. Every American president and vice president who's visited Warsaw since the fall of communism in 1989 has visited the monument. He said, "We deeply regret that President Donald Trump, though speaking in public barely a mile away from the monument, chose to break with that laudable tradition alongside so many other ones." So he spent time talking about the Warsaw Uprising by the Polish Home Army, but not about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
And from what we heard, from what we journalists heard from our sources, the Polish government had a significant amount of input into that speech which Donald Trump gave. And I'm almost 95% sure, obviously I wasn't in the room with them, that it was the Polish government who made the suggestions of where he should speak, and generally made suggestions of what he should talk about and what they'd like him to focus on. This was obviously a message very much targeted toward
very much targeted to, Remy, sorry, we just missed those last words. You said very much targeted to. We seem to have lost your audio, but we thank Remy Adekoya so much, Polish-Nigerian journalist, regular contributor to The Guardian, former political editor of the Warsaw Business Journal. His latest piece for The Guardian we'll link to, Poland's courting of Trump is a few supporters short of a picnic. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Hamburg, Germany. Stay with us. Europe by Scott Gilmore. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We go now to Hamburg, Germany, where thousands of protesters are expected to attempt to disrupt the G20 summit, where President Trump is heading next. On Wednesday, anti-G20 protesters danced through the streets of Hamburg under the motto, Lieber tanz ich als G20, meaning I prefer to dance than G20. Wednesday's protests come after actions earlier in the week when German police attacked protesters with water cannons as thousands demonstrated against the summit and Trump. The summit is seen by the protest groups as centered around exploitation of people and global resources. This is protester Cesar Henning.
I don't like how the police treat normal people. For example, the water cannons yesterday were completely unnecessary. The atmosphere was peaceful. In general, I think it's really bad that the G20 summit is being held in Hamburg. I'm not a radical left-winger or anything, but I think the police provoked the people and encouraged violence on the streets. They almost wanted to be violent.
Said around 7,500 people took part in the protest. Organizers put the figure at 18,000. For more, we go to Nick Dearden, director of the Global Justice Now. The group released a statement that said, campaigners tell the G20 your model is broken, only radical reform can undermine Trump. Nick, welcome to Democracy Now! From Hamburg, from coming off the streets to talk with us. Talk about why the protests are happening at the G20.
I think there's two reasons. I mean, one, people here in Europe don't want Donald Trump or the other right-wing populist leaders that are coming into their country. But I think there's something more than that, which is the very policies which caused Trump in the first place, the neoliberal free market policies that we've seen year after year after year. Exactly those policies are on the agenda of this G20. And so the G20 leaders like Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, they've said, well, we need globalization to work for everybody. We realize there have been mistakes and things have gone wrong. But actually, the policies they're putting forward are the same tired and broken policies that they've put forward for the last 20 or 30 years. And so many people here are saying, if we want to undermine the ideas, the values, the policies of Donald Trump, we need something radically different. And indeed, one of the best-selling dailies here, Der Spiegel, this morning, its lead article said, we need a radical set of policies, and these 20 people are not the people to express or implement those policies.
And Nick, can you describe the scene in Hamburg? How many protesters are there? And what do you expect will happen tomorrow when the summit, G20 summit, opens?
Well, last night I was on the disco protest you talked about, which had a lot of glitter, disco balls, glittery anti-Trump flags. Really exciting, really young, really enthusiastic protesters. The night before, the police had been a lot more provocative. But I mean, you're certainly talking about many, many, many thousands of protesters so far. One of the theories being put forward here is the police are being particularly provocative in order to put people off coming to the really big protests that are going to happen tomorrow and Saturday. And that may indeed be already working. A lot of people who have got kids in kindergartens here and so on are saying they're not going to bring them into the city tomorrow because they're so scared about what's going to happen. But actually, I'm here at the counter summit, if you like, where we're talking about how to build an alternative world. The background noise is the noise of activism. And everybody here is extremely thoughtful. We're having many debates about the kind of world that we actually want to see, as opposed to the G20 world that's being created. And really a very vibrant mood. Of course, people are scared. I mean, people are scared about what's happening in the world today. The world is in chaos. And Trump is a kind of symbol of that. But at the same time, there's more energy than I've seen for a very long time behind the idea that we need to build something else, something very different.
Can you talk about Trump's decision to go to Poland first, the coal country of Poland, before going to G20, where we understand that the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, will be emphasizing the issue of climate change, which Donald Trump rejects?
That's absolutely right. And the reason he decided to go to Poland is because he thought that the right-wing populist government in Poland was more likely to be supportive and friendly towards him. And we know that they bust in protesters overnight to get them there to cheer him on in Poland. Look, one of the things that Trump wants to do, because he believes in this kind of zero-sum economic game, where America must make its gains at everyone else's expense, one of the things he wants to do is weaken the competitive trading blocs as he sees them. One of those being Europe and one of those being China. He sees those as America's big competitors. So by originally supporting the Brexit referendum in Britain and now by going to Poland, he's trying to drive a wedge and stoke up nationalisms in Europe to weaken Europe because he thinks that's the best way that the United States can make economic gains. So that's why he went to Poland. He's hoping to sow divisions that will continue into this summit. He also knows that as soon as he arrives here in Hamburg, he's going to be met by tens of thousands of people protesting against him. He doesn't want that to be the media shots that are immediately sent back to the United States. He wants a nice supportive audience, so he's gone there. And indeed, there was even talk about him popping into London after he's finished at the G20, although I think he was rather underrepresented the mood there, where there's a lot of opposition and hostility towards him. But essentially, I think that his long-term strategy here is to weaken his competitors. And the problem is that his kind of beggar my neighbor global economic policies aren't just about economics, as important as that is. We've seen too often in history how trade wars can lead to real wars. And I think that's very much on everyone's mind here. It's certainly on Angela Merkel's mind. But I must say, the problem with Merkel's position, she wants to present herself as this moderate G20 leader against the nasty populists like Trump, is she actually represents nothing different to the same policies that have given rise to him. One interesting thing is he agrees with her on the deregulation stuff. He was talking about that in Poland, but he's mixed that in with some really nasty nationalist and racist politics, so that you end up with the worst of both worlds. And I think that speech in Poland will take some getting over by some of the other G20 leaders here.
And President Trump announced in Poland that Poland will be buying the Patriot missile defense system from the United States, congratulating them there. The significance of this, going from country to country to announce weapons deals.
Absolutely, and he did the same in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, right? Just before they made this decision to suspend relationships with Qatar. So everywhere he goes around the world, he's using weapons and military to try to sow division and sow nationalism. And this is one of the things that I think the protesters here, the campaigners here, are eager to try and avoid. One of the things we want to do, and we've got American citizens here alongside us at this conference, is to create a world based on cooperation, a better understanding of each other, and a world that can work in the interests of the many, not the few. And I think that's coming very clearly, and we'll need to reaffirm that in the years ahead, because the direction that Trump's going in with some of these policies is very, very dangerous to the future, not just of the United States, but the whole world.
And Nick, could you explain really the significance of the G20 summit, who's involved, what heads of state, and why it's so significant? What are the issues on the table that heads of state who are members of the G20 will be deciding?
Sure. So we used to have the G8, the 8 most powerful countries in the world that came together once a year in order to make decisions that affected the whole world. And that forum was set up broadly because world leaders at that time didn't want to discuss these things in a more democratic and sovereign forum like the United Nations. They wanted to undermine those global cooperation forums. That's why they set up things like the G8 to control energy supplies and so on. The G20 was when, during the financial crisis, the G8 realized that actually they needed to bring more countries on board if they were going to hold sway in the world. So they brought extra countries on board, like Saudi Arabia, like Argentina, like Turkey, like Mexico. But they still represent the most powerful leaders on Earth, and they discuss everything from the global economy to terrorism to aid and development, to migration, the big issues that affect everybody in the world. Now, of course, with Donald Trump, and also some of the other nationalists who are going to be here, like Erdogan of Turkey and so on, you have a breach in the unity of those global elites. They don't agree with each other anymore. And so this is going to be a very different G20 to any that we've seen before, because normally they come out with a nice communique, a nice statement that kind of says, yeah, we're really worried about all this stuff, but we're going to continue with these policies that benefit big business, the market knows best, all the stuff we've seen for so long. But what you're going to find with this summit is a really serious disagreement. And one of the big concerns that Angela Merkel has is that they don't come out with any meaningful communique at all. She's going to be talking about free trade, migration and climate change. We know that she doesn't agree with Trump on any of those issues. So you're going to see, this is probably the most significant G20 there has ever been. Because you really have a global elite divided on itself as to the best way forward. And we'll be watching in the coming days to see what comes out of that. But I think one of the big feelings here in the Counter Summit is as long as those global elites are divided in the way forward, as long as we know that they don't have the solution to the world's problems, the people need to take center stage, because it's only mass movements of people at this moment that can avert the catastrophe of runaway climate change or military buildup.
Nick, let's go back to President Trump speaking today, just minutes before we went to broadcast in Warsaw, Poland.
The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? We can have the largest economies and the most lethal weapons anywhere on earth. But if we do not have strong families and strong values, then we will be weak and we will not survive.
Nick Dearden, can you respond to President Trump from where you are in Hamburg, Germany, in the midst of an activist space, in the midst of the G20 protests, with the G20 just about to meet tomorrow?
I mean, it's a really chilling message that reminds many people here, look, we're in Germany, so reminds many people here of the catastrophe that the world went through in the 1930s. His talk of closing borders, of might is always right, of divisive nationalism is very reminiscent of the kind of politics we've seen in the past, and that should chill all of us. One of the things, though, that I think that Trump's going to find when he gets here is that the protest movement in the street actually is extremely optimistic, extremely hopeful, extremely lively, extremely diverse. And that's the only kind of movement that can beat Trump's message at the end of the day. You know, Merkel's attempt to say business as usual, everything must just go on as it was before, and that's how we'll defeat Trump. That's not going to work. We need radically different solutions, because, of course, what Trump's playing on is the fear, the poverty that's been created, the inequality that's been created, the racism that's been created by these free market policies over the last 20 years. And, you know, Trump, for me, is like a kind of poison that seeps in to the million different cracks in our global economy, in our broken society. And we've got to mend that society if we're to do anything about Trump.
Well, we want to thank you, Nick Dearden, for joining us, director of the Global Justice Now, the group releasing a statement titled "Campaigners Tell the G20 Your Model is Broken, Only Radical Reform Can Undermine Trump." We'll be going back to Hamburg tomorrow with the meeting of the G20. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined by one of the founders of Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. Stay with us.
Es un ejemplo de honor y sentimiento. la tierra y su flora, con pena hoy te llora. El río te extraña, su bosque y cada hoja. Tu gente hoy te añora. El viento es la consigna de cada ser que aboga, clamando por justicia, justicia que demora, que algún día de llegar todo tiene que cambiar por tu legado inmortal.
A tribute to Berta Cáceres by singer and composer Liam Rivera. Berta Cáceres, the indigenous environmental leader who was murdered in Honduras, her daughter Bertita Cáceres was just the victim of an assassination attack. And you can go online at DemocracyNow.org to see our conversation with her from her home in La Esperanza, Honduras. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to look at the crisis in Syria one day ahead of President Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Hamburg. Their meeting comes as thousands of Syrians continue to flee Raqqa as U.S.-backed militias intensify their assault on the ISIS-held city. Some 200,000 people have been displaced from Raqqa, with more expected to flee as fighting intensifies. U.S.-led airstrikes have killed hundreds of residents in what UN investigators have called a, quote, staggering loss of civilian life. Reports say as many as 50 airstrikes were hitting Raqqa each day. U.S.-backed forces expect the fight to oust ISIS from its de facto capital to take at least 3 months.
According to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, more than 5,300 civilians have been killed in Syria this year. This includes over 1,000 killed in airstrikes by the U.S.-led coalition. On Wednesday, escaping civilians arrived at an open-air relief camp outside Raqqa, complaining of constant airstrikes, artillery raids, and extreme hunger.
We left because of the fighting. We were afraid. We have children. We almost died of hunger, and no one helped us.
We are displaced now, and we live in the open air. These are our house belongings. We just managed to get them today. This is what we have. These are the last things we owned in the house.
We're joined right now here in our New York studio by Abdelaziz Al-Hamza. He's a Syrian journalist and activist, co-founder and spokesperson for Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. The group was formed in 2014 to document the abuses of the so-called Islamic State after the militant group took over the city of Raqqa. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Aziz. We have seen so many of the videos put out by your group. If you can start off by talking about what is the situation in Raqqa right now? I mean, you have Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin expected to meet tomorrow for the first time in Hamburg at the G20. Top of their agenda is Syria. What is actually happening on the ground?
Yes, like what's going on in Raqqa, that there are thousands of airstrikes are bombing, targeting the city daily, and it's by the international coalition led by U.S., and there are SDF militias supported and funded by U.S. is trying to take over Raqqa from ISIS. So the clashes right now in the city center, most of the, in the beginning of this year, from January to June, most of the people who've been killed, they got killed by the international coalition airstrikes. 1,454 people have been killed, mostly by U.S. airstrikes. At the same time, ISIS still doing human rights violation. There are no services in the city, no electricity, no water. People are suffering. There is no way to escape from the city or flee the city. Some people were lucky to escape last couple of weeks. Right now, it's so hard, and people, even when they're trying to go to the river to get some water, they've been killed by the airstrike. So,
I mean, I think people would be very surprised to hear this, because when they hear the name of the city Raqqa, they always hear ISIS stronghold. So when they hear people are dying, they would think it's at the hands of ISIS. But right now you're saying it is the U.S. coalition airstrikes.
Yes, so in June, like 358 people have been killed, like 177 by the airstrike, by the U.S. airstrike, 118 by SDF, supported and funded by U.S., and 60 by ISIS. So when we're talking here, like most of the people are getting killed like by the U.S. airstrike. So the airstrike is not careful. They randomly bomb the areas, and even like they started to target like civilian cars. So there is like no water at all in the city. So people they're going to the river to get their water, and even when they tried like to get water, they've been killed. So the thing, like people there are like not only suffering by ISIS, they are suffering like from all the sides, and like especially by the airstrike recently.
And Aziz, could you explain who the SDF militias are and why the U.S. is backing them, and what their specific role in Raqqa has been in these last months?
Yeah, so SDF like established in 2014 to defeat ISIS from some areas. So they are mostly YPJ, Kurdish militias group, and some other Arab brigades and some minorities like Turkmen, but it's led and controlled by YPJ. So the U.S. is using them as a tool, to defeat ISIS from some areas. And it started like with Kobani, and because like those groups are Kurdish and they were trying to protect their areas, and later on they were pushed to go and defeat ISIS from other places like Manbij and recently Raqqa.
And what about the fact, Aziz, as we've been talking about, the fact that the U.S.-led coalition has led to this extraordinary loss of life among civilians in Raqqa? Can you talk about what people in Raqqa expected when the U.S. strikes began, the U.S.-led strikes began, and whether there was any hope that it would be successful?
Yeah, so like the airstrike started like a couple of years ago, and the airstrike like we're more careful than right now. So it's like a war, it's like a conflict, and like we have to expect people are getting killed. So, but the thing like they were like so careful. Recently started like to be randomly shelling, randomly airstrikes, and people they were expecting that like okay, it will not take that long. They will be more careful. They will target like ISIS headquarters, ISIS gathering, not like killing like people everywhere, even like people who are trying like to get water. And then the people there are like so afraid, even like when SDF will take over the city.
The Syrian Defense Forces.
Yes, yeah, because like the people they had an experience with Tel Abyad and other like territories were like controlled by SDF, and SDF have been committing like human rights violation, displacing recruitment. Like recently, like they started like to recruit people like in Tel Abyad, other people like in villages in the countryside, in Raqqa countryside. So people there are like afraid to be recruited, to be forced to join the army, and to be displaced, to have their houses being burned. So people there are like so afraid to have a new group who will commit human rights violations.
I want to go back for a moment to how your organization began. You are the co-founder of Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. Take us back a few years and how you got involved.
Yeah, so like my colleagues and I, like we started to do these activities when the Syrian Revolution started in 2011, and we started to be activists. And then when ISIS came and took control of our city, I was forced to leave because ISIS discovered my identity. And, yes.
But talk even before ISIS. You were, Raqqa was a site of protest against Assad,
yes,
the
like
president.
talking before ISIS, like Raqqa joined the revolution early in the beginning. There were like many demonstrations all the time. And like in March 2012, so there were like 300,000 protesters in the streets. Later on, Raqqa was the first liberated city from Assad control, and then in a couple of weeks, there were like more than 40 society organizations, local and provincial councils. There were like the university schools started to run again, started to be a normal life, even with Assad airstrikes, until like January 2014, when ISIS took over the control of the city. So my colleagues and I, we decided to complete our work to be not only against Assad, to be against Assad and ISIS at the same time. And back that time, no one have heard about Raqqa, about ISIS. So we decided to start our organization to draw the attention of the international community, international media about what's going on in Raqqa, because ISIS did the same thing as the Syrian regime. They prevented all the media most of the media organization to enter the country and cover what's going on, and with ISIS they prevented all of them.
Well, can you explain though, Aziz, how you say that Raqqa was the first city to be liberated from Assad government control? Where did ISIS come from? How did ISIS take over where the Assad government left off?
Yeah, so they arrived after Raqqa was liberated, there was vacuum in power. So there were many groups, and 10 fighters, they came from Iraq, so they were Islamic State in Iraq, and then al-Baghdadi announced that thing. So ISIS is not a new thing. It's like a union between Islamic State in Iraq and Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda part in Syria. So they came together, they gathered together, and they established ISIS.
Well, I'd like to go back to ask about the origins of ISIS, both in Iraq and in Syria. Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, spoke at the Munich Security Conference in 2015. He suggested the US-led invasion of Iraq created the Islamic State.
The second and much more proximate cause of the instability we are witnessing today was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I spoke against it at the time, and I'm afraid my concerns have been proved well-founded. The folly of that fateful decision was compounded by post-invasion decisions, the wholesale disbandment of security forces, among other measures, poured hundreds of thousands of trained and disgruntled soldiers and policemen onto the streets.
So that's former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan speaking in 2015. So Aziz, can you respond to what he said about the origins of ISIS and what you think will happen in Raqqa once ISIS is routed from the city?
Yes, so for sure, Iraq war provided an environment to have ISIS and other groups. So there was a vacuum in power. The same thing what happened in Raqqa. So there was not a real government to run and control everything in the country. So all that things helped to create these kind of extremism groups, or provided a good environment to the extremists to come to Iraq. And later on they started to grow day after day. And the same thing happened in Syria. There was a vacuum in power. It was huge spaces and were controlled without any government, without not a real or a real government. So that helped to create that thing. And we had Al-Qaeda before Raqqa was liberated, and that also helped. So other things started with Taliban, turned to Al-Qaeda, ended up with ISIS. So that's the same thing, what will happen in Raqqa if when ISIS will be defeated. So the thing, all the governments are focusing on how to defeat ISIS by arms, so to defeat ISIS as an organization. So for us, ISIS is an idea, and as I said, it started with Taliban and ended up with ISIS. So no one was focusing on defeating the idea. So if they will defeat ISIS only as a group, so we have a whole generation of children who've been living with ISIS for 3 years, and in Raqqa there was no satellites, no TV channels, there was no access to the information. So people, they were stuck with ISIS propaganda. So if the international community will not work on defeating the idea of ISIS or the idea of extremism, we will end up with a new kind of groups will be worse than ISIS in the future. So we are afraid about the next generation. So that's the thing, no one was focusing on defeating the idea.
I want to go to a clip of the new documentary, City of Ghosts, about your group. Raqqa is being slaughtered silently.
At first glance, they seemed like other militant groups. But we soon realized that this group was unlike anything the world had seen before. They painted our city black and shrouded it in darkness. We couldn't sit by and watch Raqqa being slaughtered silently. Did you start filming? Yes.
And so that's a clip of City of Ghosts that has played at the Human Rights Watch Film Festival here in New York and is continuing to play now around the country. So your approach was to video, to film, to use cell phones, to get images out to anyone who wanted to see a different view of what was happening in your city.
Yes, so like the main reason was to show the reality of what's going on. ISIS, after they controlled Raqqa and other areas, they started to promote their propaganda. They started like to promote fake news. So we decided to film what's going on to show the people the reality, the other side of the other side of the life, the reality of the life. And later on, we decided that we not be like only a media organization. So we started to do many activities in Raqqa, like to educate, to aware the people who are living with ISIS control. So we started the graffiti campaigns, poster campaigns, and we ended up doing a magazine, has the same cover of ISIS magazine, to reach out like the largest number of people in Raqqa to educate them about what's going on.
Aziz, before we end, tomorrow Trump and Vladimir Putin will meet. What about Russia's role right now with and against, in both situations, it seems, the United States in Syria?
Yes, so like Russia has been playing like a main role in the Syrian conflict, the same as U.S. Russia, like before in 2016, killed people more than anyone, especially in Aleppo, and they're in charge of fighting extremism, and they were killing civilians all the time.
So now the numbers being killed, more are being killed by the United States and Russia than by ISIS.
Yes, so the thing right now, like it would be great if we'll have like a non-fly zone. We've been talking about non-fly zones when the revolution then turned to conflict started. So we were asking to have like a safe area to the civilians to go there and stay in case they want to be out of this conflict between all these countries. It's not a local issue anymore. It's like a proxy war between like Russia, US, Iran, Hezbollah, thousands of groups, tens of countries are fighting each other in Syria, and every one of them has like interest in Syria. So we want to have like the Syrian people out of it. So right now, like the Syrian people, they want to just survive. All what they are thinking about how to be alive for the next day, and they don't care about these like international conflicts that are taking place in Raqqa and Syria.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Abdelaziz Al-Hamza is a Syrian journalist and activist, co-founder and spokesperson for Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Malkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Shanivarina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.